Hey there, I'm Rabbi Nathan, and welcome to Jewish Future Law, the series where we explore emergent technologies and their impact on Jewish law, practice, and ethics. In this episode, when do you light Shabbat candles on Mars? For thousands of years, Jews have marked the beginning of Shabbat and other holidays by lighting candles. This is done at a particular time of day, at sundown, based on the biblical verses from the beginning of Genesis. There was evening and there was morning, a first day. Because evening comes first, in Judaism, a new day starts and ends at sundown. Just like the Gregorian calendar arbitrarily determines midnight as the point which separates one day from the next, in the Hebrew calendar, that point is at sundown. The commandments regarding observing Shabbat and other holidays are central to Jewish practice, and so questions about the correct time to light candles are important. Obviously, the time of sundown depends on what time zone you're in. But what do you do if you're not in any time zone and there is no sundown? Consider an astronaut orbiting the Earth at a low Earth orbit. Because of the speed that they orbit the Earth, an astronaut aboard the International Space Station experiences a sunrise and a sunset every 90 minutes. Does that mean that for astronauts in orbit, Shabbat occurs every 10 and a half hours and only lasts for 90 minutes? Like all questions of Jewish practice, we refer back to the Talmud, which always has some wisdom it can offer. In this case, the medieval rabbis talk about traveling between different parts of the world. They determined that somebody who's traveling from one city to another should observe Shabbat whenever the locals are. But while somebody is traveling on a boat, they should base their Shabbat observance on when they observe a sunset. Those laws have been extrapolated and applied to air travel as well. If you find yourself on an El Al flight traveling from New York to Tel Aviv, you'll notice that the halachically observant Jews on the flight will observe the traditional prayer times almost one after another, so that on a weekday, they still have the opportunity to pray 3 times. And if you find yourself traveling from east to west, you'll see the exact opposite. The days become longer, and so the prayer times are spaced further apart. It would seem, based on that practice, that an astronaut would in fact have to observe 90-minute days. Although on this channel, I deal almost exclusively with hypothetical technologies. Jewish law is based entirely on real-world situations. There is no such thing as preemptive halacha. It was not until the first Israeli astronaut traveled to space that these questions came to be answered definitively. His name was Colonel Ilan Ramon of blessed memory, and he traveled on the ill-fated 2003 Columbia flight. He was the first Jew to observe halakha in space. Before he took off, he consulted with a local rabbi to determine exactly when he should observe Shabbat. The determination was not made by comparing a spaceship with an airplane, but rather by comparing it with a completely different situation. What do you do when you're living in a place where sunrise and sunset don't happen as they do elsewhere on Earth? This question was actually asked hundreds of years before the space flights. When Jewish people began to travel and live in places beyond the Arctic Circle, these questions became crucial. If the sun rises and stays up for months at a time, does that mean Shabbat could last for months? Just like the case of an astronaut in orbit, the impracticality of such a practice automatically invalidates it. There's just no way you could do it in real life. So the rabbis of the day determined that one should observe Shabbat based on the last place that they saw a regular sunrise and sunset. That same logic was put into practice by Colonel Ramon. And when he was traveling in space, he used the Cape Canaveral clock. When it was sunset in Cape Canaveral, he would mark the end of one Hebrew day and the beginning of the next. Now that it's been put into practice, that same principle would be applied to anybody in a spaceship, whether they're traveling in orbit, landing on the moon, or going all the way to Mars. Companies like SpaceX are already creating a timeline for human colonization of Mars. We know how to observe Shabbat during the months-long trip to get there, but once we land, there might be a new set of rules. The length of a day on Mars from sunset to sunset is conveniently close to the length of a day on Earth. In fact, it's 24 hours and 40 minutes, just a little bit longer than a day on Earth. A year on Mars is 687 Earth days, which is just under 2 years. For Mars to travel all the way around the Sun, it takes from January 1st all the way through until November 18th of the following year. Mars also has a similarly tilted axis, just like we do on Earth. The tilt of the Earth's axis is what gives us the season. When your hemisphere is tilted towards the Sun, you have summer, and when it's tilted away, you have winter. Living on Mars, you would experience those same seasons too. We should consider all of this because it's not just Shabbat that's at stake, but all of the Jewish holidays. If you observed Mars days from sunset to sunset, it would only be a couple of weeks before you were completely off from anything matching the days on Earth. And because of the length of the year, the holiday times might change too. The first Jewish people to settle on Mars will have some important decisions to make. They could celebrate holidays based on the season that they belong in, with Passover in the spring and Sukkot in the fall. But because the year is so much longer, those dates would no longer match with any calendar on Earth. Alternatively, they could stick with our traditional terrestrial calendar, but the holidays would no longer show up in the right seasons. Now that situation might not be so terrible. After all, the Muslim calendar, for example, cycles through the seasons as the years go by, meaning Ramadan can occur in the middle of summer or the middle of winter depending on what year it is. And they have been going strong as a religion for 1400 years. However, something about that idea sits a little bit uneasily with me. Jewish holidays have always been closely tied up with the natural world and the seasons in which they occur. Holidays like Passover, the counting of the Omer, Shavuot, Sukkot, and others are all closely tied with the harvest and natural cycles. The month that Passover occurs in is referred to by the Bible as the spring month. The answer to the question of holidays is so complex, it probably deserves a video of its own. So let's stick with Shabbat. We basically have two options, and they're a little bit simpler. Option 1 is to stick with the Earth clock. Astronauts would measure from the location on Earth that they launched from, keep that calendar as they traveled to Mars, and once they landed, use that clock as the basis of their daily observance. But there are some pretty real problems that would emerge right away. After just a couple days, the candle lighting times wouldn't match up with anything close to sunset. There would be times that you'd have to wake up in the middle of the night to light candles, or stop working in the middle of the day. Additionally, you could end up with people living in the same colony who launched from different locations on Earth and are celebrating completely different times. One from China, one from Russia, one from the US. You could have 5 or 6 different Mars colonists right next to each other, lighting candles at different times. With all of those problems, let's consider the second option. The astronauts take off from Earth. While they're in transit, they follow the Earth clock, and every 24-hour period is a day. Every 7 days, it's Shabbat. Once they land on Mars, they continue counting the days. But rather than using a 24-hour Earth clock, they use the natural Mars calendar of 24 hours and 40 minutes from sunset to sunset. Any future colonist to arrive would be entering an already set custom. When it's Tuesday on Mars, regardless of the day on the Earth clock, new colonists would call that day Tuesday. Mars is enough like Earth to qualify as having its own sunrise and sunset, just like being a different time zone. People would observe the cycle of Shabbat according to the sunrise and sunset. The Torah connects the cycle of day and night to the human sleep cycle. With regard to the morning and evening prayers, we read in the book of Deuteronomy, "Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise up." Halakha connects the natural cycle of sleeping and waking with the cycle of the day. So if people living on a planet sleep and wake with the natural cycle of that planet's day, as we would expect on Mars, then they should count a day from sunset to sunset, just like we do here on Earth. However, if we settle on a planet with extremely long or extremely short days, then we would use the same principle that astronauts in orbit use. We would base our days on a 24-hour period following the time and place that we left Earth. What about going beyond Mars and our own solar system? Interstellar travel introduces a new problem: relativity. You see, at extreme speeds and gravities, time dilation occurs. That means that for somebody in a spaceship traveling close to the speed of light or very near a black hole, time travels more slowly inside the spaceship than for those of us in the rest of the universe. For an astronaut in a ship affected by relativity, Shabbat might occur every 7 hours or 7 seconds at the point of origin because of time dilation. Not only that, but the changing speeds and gravities of interstellar space would involve incredibly complex computations to determine exactly what time it is on Earth. It might be hard to believe, but this problem is discussed in the Talmud, even earlier than the Talmud, in the Hebrew Bible. In the book of Joshua, we read an account of the supernatural manipulation of time. And the sun stood still and the moon halted, while a nation wreaked judgment on its foes. Thus the sun halted in mid-heaven and did not press on to set for a whole day. In that particular case, what did the Jewish people do? They waited for sunset to observe Shabbat. That tells us that a day can be longer or shorter than 24 hours, depending on the perspective of the observer. Based on that story, you might conclude that sunset is the key event in determining when Shabbat starts. Whenever sun sets on Earth, regardless of how long or short that takes, that's when you should observe. As we've already said, that would be extremely complicated in a near-light ship. But that story is merely an illustration of the flexibility of time. We now understand that in reality, time is flexible. The theory of relativity confirms it. We get a more useful and definitive answer from a passage in the Talmud. It reads, Rav Huna said, if one is traveling on a road or in the wilderness and does not know when it is the Sabbath, he must count 6 days and observe a Sabbath. So what should the astronaut do? She would observe Shabbat according to her own watch, continuing her count of days based on the time and place that she left. An even simpler solution to all of these problems was once suggested. The one question that I never asked is, do you even have to observe Shabbat in space at all? Do religious obligations stop once you leave Earth? The idea isn't so far-fetched. After all, we have different laws living in the land of Israel and other lands. Those of us living in the diaspora have different obligations related to tithes and holiday observance. In 1970, Rabbi Ben-Zion Feirer posited that once we leave the earth, we're not obligated in any of the mitzvot that are tied to earth itself. He based this on a reading in the Talmud of Deuteronomy 12, which says that we are obligated in the commandments all the days that we're alive on this earth. However, that view was swiftly rejected. Rabbi Menachem Kasher explained that the Jewish laws and obligations don't reside in the place or time that they're obligated, but in the person performing them. God's laws are not out in the universe, they're in us. They exist within each and every person who carries out the obligations of God, regardless of where we travel. We read as much in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 30, where we read these words, surely the obligation that I instruct you in today is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us, and impart it to us, that we may observe it. Rather, it is something very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to do it. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. And that's my take. Let me know, what did you like? What did I miss? What questions do you still have? What topics do you want to hear about next? Let me know in the comments down below and join the conversation. Shalom, I'll see you next time, and keep asking questions.